Internalization, emotion exegesis, and performance, a deepening spiral. So why did I go there, you might ask? You're seeing just my screen? Does it look okay? All right. Um, yeah, because I thought everybody in OBT, we all talk about internalization. It's so important, right? It's the way that you get your drafts done. It's the way you learn the passages. It's people have called it the heart of OBT. Um, and then in the past year, 2 years, give or take, this phrase emotion exegesis has become the thing a lot of people are talking about and talking about how important it is. Um, how does that relate to oral Bible translation? How do we come to an understanding of emotion exegesis? And then to me, one of the biggest pieces, the important things in OBT that we don't always talk about is this performance side. Because if it's not performed well, it doesn't really matter how good the translation is, right? It has to be performed appropriately. And that involves a whole bunch of different layers. So as I started thinking about these three things and how they fit together, I realized it's really this kind of deepening spiral because you do some exegesis, then you do some internalization, which follows you back into your exegesis. But all of this comes together into a performance, which, if it's not quite where it needs to be, goes back into internalization and exegesis. So it's this spiral that you get deeper and deeper as you progress forward. So why talk about these things? First, we need to be intentional about performance. I think there was this assumption at the very beginning of all this that if we internalize the performance is going to be the right performance. It's going to come out the right way. It's going to be natural. It's going to be beautiful. But we really need to be intentional. We can't leave it to chance or to an individual's preference. I think that sounds good. Based on what? Like why does that sound good? And why do you think that other group that's doing it doesn't sound good? Or maybe you think they sound good. What are you basing these things on? And how do we come up with that? So that's the broad topic I'm going to talk about today. So some key questions that I like to keep in the forefront of my mind as I'm doing OBT, just sort of floating around. Are people going to trust this translation enough to listen to it to begin with? Because if they never listen, it doesn't matter. Are they going to enjoy it enough to listen to it a second time or more times than that even? So you have to not just do something that it's going to get their attention, but you got to get it in a way that they're going to be willing to listen more. Are they going to understand what the text is actually saying or maybe supposed to say? How do we know, right? How do we know these answers? So how do we communicate meaning in general? Well, some meaning comes from what you say, but that's not the only part of it. The way you say it communicates a huge amount of the meaning behind what you're doing. Meaning understanding. Okay, so we've got linguistic content, the words, semantics, discourse, right? There's something in there on the text, these old texts that we look at from thousands of years ago. There's something in the linguistic content. When we start to look at these words and the way they're put together, sometimes we have a memory. We have some kind of correlation, some kind of connection to that might add or layer meaning, make us understand things maybe differently than we would have if we didn't have that memory. An emotional connection of some sort. When we add oral to this equation, and it's not just the words on the page, how it is performed impacts us in a certain way, and it can trigger assumptions in us based on the style of the performance, based on the genre of the performance. All those things will trigger assumptions and affect the impact of the words that we've chosen. So not just the words we're reading on a page. A text meaning crystallizes only when we can trace the flow of thought from beginning to end. In-depth knowledge of both individual words, phrases, clauses, how they relate to each other in a bigger paragraph, in a bigger story, in a bigger pericope, in a book that they occur in. Said by one author might mean something different when it's then said by a different author. So we have to identify these flows and then figure out how do we put all this together and how do we communicate it. Performance. First, I just want everybody to acknowledge it matters. Okay, hopefully you're all there already. But how do you get there? How do you make it specific to your situation, to your audience, to their expectations, to your consultant's expectations? How do we determine what is appropriate? I like to talk about this thing I call grounded performance. And what I mean by grounded is grounded in the exegesis of Scripture, because that's where our meaning is coming from. It's our understanding of the text that we're trying to present. If we are giving any kind of performance that is not in line with the intent of the Scripture, it's a bad performance, no matter how nice it might sound to our ears. It's not the appropriate performance. Okay, what contributes to performance? So, as I said already, it's a discourse and genre. If I'm playing some, scary music in the background and then I start to talk happily, it's going to be a weird performance, right? The genres aren't matching. The discourse, the overall arch of what you're presenting isn't matching very well. Again, we come back to this word, emotions. Emotions are conveyed through our intonation, our prosody. If there's speech acts or direct quotes, how they're intoned is going to make a difference in terms of what people understand. And then you've got sociolinguistic dynamics. What do I mean by sociolinguistic dynamics? Wow, what a big word, right, to throw out there. There's so many layers to sociolinguistic dynamics. It has to do with where people are. It has to do with who people are, who else is in the scene with them. What are the expectations of the environment that they're in? All those things working together bring a different tenor to a scene. Something that might be perfectly appropriate to say at the dinner table would not be perfectly appropriate to say in the temple. So we have to look at the actions, we have to look at the locations, we have to look at the people. Something that might be perfectly acceptable as a way to, sorry, I'm hot and cold in this room. Okay, there we go. Might be perfectly acceptable to say to a child would not be perfectly acceptable to say to a teacher. So how people are addressing one another based on their social roles, all of those things play together and contribute to the overall understanding and the performance of the scene. I hope you're understanding, as I've given this little teeny introduction, it's not about dramatization. It's not about putting on a play or creating a even vocal performance in a way that's a dramatization of a scene. It's about every single time we open our mouths and talk, we hear things in a certain way, and that contributes to the meaning underneath. Okay, so internalization and exegesis. These two things together will help you get to the correct performance. And these, as I've said a couple of times, need to be based in understanding the source, and that includes the emotions of the source. I promise you I will get at some point a little bit further down the way to talking a little bit about what that means. However, none of this talk is going to be how to do any of these things per se, but to encourage you to connect them appropriately for your situation and to give you some resources on how to get to these spots. Anyone who's taken my class, and there's a couple of you out there, have seen this pyramid that we talk about. As we start to look at a draft of scripture, a passage that we're going to draft, we have to start with trying to understand it, looking at the exegesis. And then if we're doing it orally especially, but really we're encouraged to do this in almost any translation nowadays, we start to do an internalization, which will lead to a draft. Each of these is going up a little bit. You can't internalize more than you've exegeted. You can't draft better than you've internalized. You can't do a peer review on anything more than your first draft, right? You have to, all these layers build on top of each other. And we've always had these little circles that you see in the dark. That's not going to show up on your screen, sorry. So the little dark circles of peer review and community check and consultant, where there's always been a cycle there. We peer review, we send it to our peers, they give us some feedback. We might say, okay, we need to do that again based on their feedback. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. You'll notice I've added these two red arrows on the sides with internalization and exegesis. And okay, first draft might be in that same thing because where are the lines? The lines are very blurry in these three base foundational steps. And I hope that as you draft, if there's something you don't understand, you'll go back and look in the exegesis. As you're internalizing, if you need to ask questions, you'll go back to the exegesis. As you're performing in your first draft, all these things, it just cycles through and through and through until you get to a solid first draft that you can send to your peers. If you send, and I've seen this happen, a draft to your peers to review, and it's just the words, and we're gonna put some intonation into it on the next round. How can you possibly judge if that's a good translation or not? You have no idea how those words are going to sound in reality when they really think about how it's going to be said, right? This all needs to be built into the internalization, into the draft, and understood from the exegesis that you do. All right. So internalization and exegesis of the emotions present. So I'm building up to emotion exegesis here, okay? So internalization has to do with orally processing the text. As you're doing this, you have to include some emotions. Some form of emotion is going to come out just because you're saying it out loud, right? You want to make sure that whatever is being communicated by the way you're saying it out loud is communicating the meaning appropriately, okay? So, internalization and emotion exegesis, it's part of oral Bible translation because we have to figure out how to say a passage appropriately. And to do that, you kind of have to do your homework or you won't have the basis for what you are communicating. The saddest thing to me is to see a group that says, okay, we basically know what's going on. How do you feel about it? Well, how do you feel about it? And they bring out the way they are reacting to the text as the appropriate emotion to be shared. You'll share some emotion and it may or may not be appropriate. The Holy Spirit can work through that. But if you haven't gotten a good meaning from the text that you're working with, you may choose a wrong emotion based on something from your past, something that's triggered you, based on your understanding of the social situation that you've misunderstood. So if you haven't built all these pieces together, you haven't done your homework and you may or may not come to a correct understanding. So internalization. Chris is here. Chris said internalization is mentally processing a piece of information to the point that the translator owns it. They must experience it on a deeper level than merely intellectually. Actions, emotions, sights, sounds build a vividness of the experience and ultimately the naturalness when translated in their own words. So this is something that we've all been throwing around for, 5 years now, Chris, as a great way to think about internalization. This year, Brian Harmelink published a paper talking about internalizing the whole text. It had to do with a lot of holistic understanding. Internalization is entering into the story so that it becomes part of you. In many ways, internalization has become the heart of processes used in oral and sign language translations because of the benefits to translators as they develop a holistic understanding of the text to be translated. So this concept of internalization, we've been thinking about it for a while. And it's really at the heart, and it's really getting to the heart of the passage. So it has to do with understanding. You can't translate something you don't understand. That was said decades ago, right? Understanding. Cycling through content. So internalization isn't just a superficial understanding, but cycling through the content of what's there. Not necessarily the individual words, but the entire content of what's there. As you do this, you'll discover meaning. You and a team that you're working with, the whole team of translators, talking together about what they're seeing in this content. As you're doing this, you're making connections between yourself and the text, connecting different parts of the text with each other, understanding how it all fits together, how these different pieces to the puzzle, the different parts of content work together to bring a greater understanding. And as you talk through this, as you perform the text repeatedly for each other, you gain confidence in your delivery. And part of having a successful oral translation really lies in the confidence in your delivery. If you are delivering something that sounds tentative, I'm not sure if I know the next word. What is that? What was that again? It's not instilling confidence in your hearers that this is an authoritative text. you're not communicating to them that this is something to be taken seriously. So gaining confidence in delivery is a huge part of the internalization process, a huge result of the internalization process that we need to look at very carefully. So as you cycle through these different things, you build connections. And the more connections you make, the more likely you are to remember. Why does all this matter? It matters because we don't want decisions about wording to be random. If we understand the content, we're going to pick the right words. If we understand the meaning, we're going to pick the right words. We don't often say this, but we don't want the decisions about the performance to be random either, right? We also want that to be based in our understanding of the text. All right, let me talk to you just for a minute about the science of memory. So how do we remember things? How does it come in, and how does internalization play into this puzzle? Something comes at us through our senses. It might be hot, cold, it might be a flavor, it might be words. They come at us and we take in sensory information. That goes into our sensory memory. If we pay attention to it, then it goes into our short-term memory. If there's some sort of rehashing, rehearsing, playing with things in your short-term memory, they can eventually become encoded and put into our long-term memory. And from long-term memory, sometimes information is lost if you never revisit it again. So sometimes we have to shift it back to our short-term memory, reactivate it, and then it shifts back into long-term memory, this encoding process. So when we're talking about internalization, we're talking about a whole bunch of sensory memory, not just hearing the words, but experiencing the words. And whatever that means to you, does that mean drawing? Does that mean visualizing? Does that mean acting things out? Does that mean random objects? There's a whole bunch of different ways that people have talked about that we can build our senses into, like kinesthetically, even sensory, like smelling and tasting things that help us get this sensory information. If we force ourselves to pay attention there and activate a bunch of different parts of our bodies and mind at the same time, then we'll pay more attention and our mind will make more connections. And short-term memory will be formed of this event. And then as we interact with that, it goes into our long-term memory, okay? So that brings up this whole thing, memorization, internalization. What's the difference? And are we really talking about just one of these things? So memorization is focusing on the form of the material, exact wording. Internalization, on the other hand, is focusing on the content, sinking so deep that we can change the form based on our audience because we've got the content. The words may or may not be in our heads, but the content is there. It starts with solid exegesis because to remember the content, we have to understand it. If we don't understand it, we're going to have trouble putting it into the right place in our minds. We have to change the form appropriately to our situation. And that's part of the internalization. Which parts are stable? The meaning is stable. Which parts are malleable? How it's delivered, the language it's delivered in. Possibly the genre can change for our situation. But if we have the content, we can make those decisions about the delivery after we know what the content's supposed to be. We also have to think about when is the form vital, because sometimes form is more vital than other times. And that might also depend on your translation brief, what you've decided about what's important for this particular translation. All of that conversation is part of your internalization and part of putting the pieces together in this puzzle. As most of you know, in an oral translation process, we focus on internalization because we want the story to be central. We want the content to be central. And we want that to influence our thinking and our behavior. It's different than traditional memorization because, as I've said, it engages the whole person. And it results in a deeper understanding. You can memorize things without understanding them, but you can't internalize something without understanding it. All right. So is internalization just about naturalness? Some people fall down there pretty solidly. However, it also will help you do a lot better with accuracy. It will help you accurately relate emotions. because emotions come out if you've internalized well. It will help you see how each part comes together to create the whole. It'll help you understand how the dialogue contributes to the meaning and therefore how it should be expressed in your translation. And it will hopefully lead not just to your understanding, but to your audience's understanding, to the hearer's understanding. All right, the 4 E's is something I thank Katie Hugerhart Trust for sharing with me. She's put these things together as a way to think about how we do internalization. First, there's exposure. And in the exposure, I'm going to talk about in a minute a little bit more on exposure. We're experiencing the whole text. Next, we experience it in some way that adds different senses to our experience, right? That's why it's called experience. We're experiencing the text, not just thinking about it. Then we re-engage. So the experience maybe looks at the parts more directly. The re-engagement goes back to the whole to see how the parts fit into the whole. And then we continue with our internalization to establish consistency until we can perform an entire text consistently with all the pieces in place. We haven't finished our internalization. So if we think a little bit more about the exposure in round one, I really like to do just a getting to know the text, building those connections by having the whole story there in some way, usually if I can in multiple languages or multiple versions. As I'm doing this, I like to give contextualized background. Where does this fall in the story? How do I know? What do you need to know about this to understand it better? And then I like this to spend a little bit of time visualizing it. Picture the scene in your mind. Before I try doing anything with my body, I just want to try to picture the whole thing. Excuse me. And then, how is this important? Why is it important to me? Why is it important to you? How do our emotions come together in this? So this is actually thinking about our own emotions, not necessarily the emotions of the text, though those will come into play as well. So engaging here is the starting point. Big picture, know what's going on. Are there pieces of this puzzle I don't understand well? This is where we're going to find out. And then I'll experience those details, dig into some of the details I don't understand as well, right? Re-engage with the whole. How do those details now re-engage with the whole? So it's this back and forth process. And then, as I said, getting to establish consistency. So as we associate different things in ourselves and our environment, we internalize those things. That will push us into handling or interacting with the pieces of the text that we're working with. As we're interacting with the pieces, we might see things that we don't get quite as well, so we'll have to associate something else with them. Okay, let's handle them again. Go back, interact with them more. This, as we do it, is going to lead to understanding and help everyone on our team lead to an understanding of this passage. So internalization is forcing you to look at the bigger picture. I admit, sometimes it feels more natural to focus in on details, especially if there's a piece I don't understand or if there's a tricky word in there I want to get to. But if I force myself to look at the bigger picture, it will make my translation smoother. If I focus in on those tiny details and only on those tiny details, my translation is going to end up really stilted. And then just to reiterate, if I don't have a deep understanding of this passage, I really won't be able to internalize it. I won't be able to get all that content in place in order together, because if I don't understand it, I won't be able to internalize it and I won't be able to translate it. So exegesis is vital. Understanding that passage is vital. Internalization done well requires proper understanding. I think I just said that. But it also yields a deeper understanding. We want the surface content and the underlying emotions. All right. I have been talking around and about emotion exegesis for a while. Josh Frost brought this quote in his thesis, which he just is now online now, you can find. Faithfulness to the biblical text in audio translations requires accurately identifying and translating emotions. Okay. It sounds decent. It sounds like something that makes sense, but the question comes up, how individual are emotions? I mean, emotions arise subjectively to how I am responding to a situation, right? Kind of, they do. But they've also been conventionalized and they're expressed within an individual linguistic community and individual culture in certain ways. So we express emotions in ways that we understand usually with each other. I can see you're mad. I can tell by your face that you're surprised. We were talking about Jim's face earlier, that he looked sneaky or something. So we make these judgments based on our culture, based on the things that we know. If we know enough about a culture, we can examine a text objectively to find the emotion that's being expressed inside of that text. Might sound like a little bit of a jump for some, but let's talk a little bit more about it. So here's some assumptions. People experience emotional reactions. Something happens, we react. These emotions are triggered, but they tend to follow scripts. And those scripts can be very culturally specific, or they can come from being a human. There's a bunch of different layers to how this works. But because they follow scripts, they actually are a little bit predictable. And we can make these common judgments together because we're all human. But here's the underlying thing that I want you to understand. We can only make these underlying judgments about what the emotions are, what people are responding to, if we have sufficient data. Okay. Take a breath, right? What do I have to understand? What is this data? So emotions appear at different levels of a language. Some given words have emotional connotations, right? The choice of a given word in a situation might make you respond in a certain way. If there's a choice to the word and a specific iteration is chosen, not the most common word, there might be a reason behind it, and some of that might be emotional. Writing styles carry indications of emotions and attitudes. And when the style is broken or there's something unusual in the style, we can look for a reason behind that choice. And again, speech acts have to be understood in their context. So people communicate emotion in their word choices, syntactic structures, and many other layers of the text. So people who get to know the biblical languages really well can see these things coming to light. Wow, this reads like this, because they know the language so well. This means that source texts do contain information that can set parameters for performance features, such as emotions and attitudes. When we're translating orally, there's obvious emotional overtones. We can't ignore it. The emotional force and implications of an utterance are what people remember best because the brain is hardwired to encode emotionally salient information. When something happens and we're shocked or we're sad or we're mad, we're much more likely to remember that than if it's just like, oh, well, that was boring. That just happened, whatever, right? It's the way our minds are hardwired. When it impacts our emotions, we remember it better. So speech acts have to serve their intended purpose and be voiced properly to the sociolinguistic situation, as we talked about earlier, all those different layers of the sociolinguistics. So emotion exegesis. Whew. How do we look at the texts? It requires engaging with the text, not just as an academic person, but on a personal level. What would your reactions be to some of the things that are going on? Put yourself into the text. To do that, you have to have some knowledge of the culture and the worldview. And we have to integrate pragmatic implications of the background knowledge into how that would come out in the words or in the situations that we see. Some of you are thinking, well, that's a lot. I don't have that in my background. I don't know the biblical backgrounds well enough. I don't know the biblical languages well enough. So this is an encouragement for you to get to know, pay attention to some of those things a little bit more deeply, but also to lean into resources that can help you where you don't know enough about that situation to know, was this a surprising event or not? That's what was supposed to happen there? Oh, okay. So finding out that background material can be really important. What do you look at in the context, in the culture? You look at frame of mind. You look at relationships, expectations of a given event, default responses. How should that person have responded in that situation? What are their foundational values? Don't forget about the location. Like I said, something that happens in the temple versus something that happens on a boat in the middle of the lake will have different kinds of language and different kinds of expectations. So the location can really impact what you're seeing. So as you are doing exegesis, take notes on the emotionally relevant information that you see while studying each aspect of the text, these little puzzle pieces. Because at some point, as you talk through the text, these little pieces of information are going to come out that you say, oh, wow, that's why that's happening here. That's how he must have felt here. If you have the pieces, you can put them together. If you've taken notes, you'll help yourself remember what's there, especially if you're the one who's responsible for doing the background exegesis or helping a team go through that step. Emotion exegesis with internalization will get you to a grounded performance. Performing the text in cycles allows for synthesis of the findings. What do I mean by that? Oh, I just read this little piece of information. Let me perform it with that in mind. How's that going to come out in my voice? How's that going to come out in the pauses that I put in for dramatic effect? Yes, those pauses do matter. Because if I put it in the wrong place, it's going to make you wonder why I stopped there, right? It's the way we rhythm our speech makes an impact. Performing is a means of identifying and evaluating the interpretation option. I'm going to be honest. It's still unknown. The exact things are still kind of unknown, and we're making our best guesses. But how we make those guesses needs to be grounded in as much information as we have. So we might perform it and go, that just feels really wrong based on all that I know about this scene. The way that voice came across did not sound like the way I understand the content of this scene. So the performing helps you identify if the interpretation options, when there's two options, which one actually hits better. And sometimes in a different culture, one choice or the other might be the better choice. And there's some gray area there, and we need to allow for that. All of these layers help you engage with scripture on a personal level. And therefore, as a human, you can think about the emotions how it impacts you, and therefore what kind of performance you need to put into the scene. So Josh Ross' thesis was about streamlining a method, or how should you go about figuring this stuff out, and especially as a practitioner who has maybe little access to some of the background information and everything else that you might need. So he suggested 4 steps, which I'm going to share with you. You're welcome to read his whole thesis, which is on DIU's website now. If you really want to see the whole thing. His whole method is very intense and deep, and most of us won't have the time to do that. But if I'm praying that the people who do have the time and the background knowledge and the training to do that will make their findings known to the rest of us. People like Josh who can do this can share what he's found with others. So first thing, internalize and perform the text. Next, identify phrases that are in marked focus. What this means is looking at the original language. Are there phrases, the way that they are, the word order, the grammar that was chosen, that are somehow marked for focus? Identify those. Consult 1 or 2 technical commentaries, if you can, about how they took these things, and then perform the passage again. Put it all together as best you can based on these things. So if you can do those 4 steps, you'll get a long way into getting to a better emotional exegesis. If you're not sure how to identify phrases in marked focus, there are some tools in Logos that can help you do that. They point out marked focus in different passages. So we can talk about that at some point, or you can ask someone who's a little bit more familiar with languages or how those resources work to help you there. But you don't have to know on your own how to identify them. You can get it from the commentaries. Okay, some final thoughts, and then we'll do some discussion. In the conversation I had with Nikki Mustin a couple months ago now, she said, not doing emotion exegesis is like ignoring the Greek or the Hebrew, not looking at commentaries, not thinking about discourse. It's just such a key aspect. So we were just having this conversation about, what do you think about it? And she's like, oh, you got to do it. It makes such a big difference in the translation. So that's our encouragement to you from there. You may have heard of exegetical diaries. If you're an exegetical consultant, helping a team look through exegesis in some way, take good notes. so that you can remember what things stuck out to you, but also as you're working with the team, the things that are helping them do internalization, the places where they had trouble. Remind them of why you made certain decisions. Where did you end up spending a lot of time discussing? Take notes. If you have to revise this in 6 or 7 months, it's good to know how you got there and why, and how it's coming out in your performance. But so you know, the more you do this, the faster you get. It takes a little while to get used to it, but with a little bit of investment in time up front, you can process a large amount of data, large amount of verses, and a little bit of time with appropriate emotions. Be encouraged and encourage your team. When teams get the hang of the process, they actually get better and faster. And consultants, this is one of the reasons consultants should be available to the team when they're exegeting before they internalize, so they can get some of these concepts down right from the beginning. Okay, front loading your efforts. Good exegesis gives you good internalization. Good internalization will give you better drafting. A better draft will get you faster and better peer review. Better revision, give you more fruitful community checks. Better community checks get better quality revisions with less for a consultant to find, and easier revisions in the long run overall each time you have to revise. And there's a slide of a whole bunch of resources that you can look at. And that's all I have to share. I can open it up for questions and discussion at this point.